Please and please subscribe to this channel and support us. Your subscription means a lot to us.
I'm signing the papers now.
There is a certain kind of man the world learns to look straight through. He mops the floors you walk on and empties the bins you forget you ever filled. And in all the years he spends doing it, not one of the important people ever bothers to learn his name. Marcus Bell was that kind of man. 47 years old, a hospital maintenance worker on the night shift, raising a daughter alone and watching his mother's body fail a little more with every passing month. He had exactly $7 in his checking account the morning a stranger in a $2,000 suit walked up to him in a parking garage and offered him $500,000. All Marcus had to do, the man said, was marry a woman he had never met, a woman who could not speak, could not move, and, they promised him, would never wake up. They handed a poor man $500,000 to marry a woman who couldn't say yes. They told him she would never open her eyes again. And the truth is, they were counting on it. Her name was Vivian Ashford, the only granddaughter of one of the wealthiest families in America, sole heir to an empire worth more than $1 billion. For 3 months, she had lain in a private hospital room, kept breathing by machines, her eyes closed to a world that had already begun quietly carving up everything she owned. The family called it a tragedy. They wore the grief beautifully in front of the cameras. But behind the polished doors of the Ashford estate, something far colder was moving through that house. Something the grieving relatives were very careful never to say out loud, even to each other. By the time this is over, you will understand why they were so certain Vivian Ashford would never wake up, and what one overlooked, ordinary man was willing to risk to make sure that she did. 3 weeks after Marcus said, "I do," to a bride who could not answer him, a monitor in that hospital room began to beep in a rhythm it had not made in months, and a nurse went running down the corridor, screaming for a doctor. What Marcus discovered in the days that followed would tear a billion-dollar family apart from the inside, and not one of the people who had used him ever saw it coming. This is the story of a man the world counted out, and a fortune that revealed exactly who every last one of them truly was. Before we go any further, I want you to hold 3 questions in your mind, because everything that follows turns on them. First, why would a family worth more than $1 billion go looking through a hospital's maintenance staff for a husband? They could have bought anyone. They could have arranged anything. Yet they wanted a poor man specifically, a man with no money, no lawyer, and no family able to ask questions. Second, why were they so absolutely certain that Vivian would never wake up? Doctors deal in maybe. They deal in we cannot say. But the Ashfords spoke about her future with the confidence of people who already knew the ending. And third, the question that would eventually undo them all. What exactly was in that hospital room that they did not want anyone like Marcus to see? Keep those 3 questions close, because the people in this story spent a great deal of money making sure no one ever asked them. On one side, you have the Ashfords. Old money, older secrets. A family that had learned generations ago how to make inconvenient truths disappear behind lawyers and donations and carefully worded press statements. On the other side, you have Marcus Bell, a man whose entire life could fit in the trunk of the 15-year-old car he prayed would start each morning. Between them lies a woman who cannot speak for herself, worth more asleep than most people are worth awake. The family assumed the gap between these 2 worlds was so wide that no truth could ever cross it. They were wrong, and the reason they were wrong is the heart of this whole story. To understand what Marcus did, you first have to understand what Marcus was. He grew up on the east side of a working city, raised by a mother named Ruth, who cleaned houses by day and took in ironing by night, and who taught him one sentence he would carry for the rest of his life: a man's word is the only thing they can't repossess. When Marcus was 19, his father walked out and never came back, and Marcus quietly took the second job that let his mother keep the lights on. He never finished college. He never got the break other men seemed to get so easily. What he got instead was a reputation, among the few who bothered to notice, as a man who did what he said he would do, showed up when he said he would show up, and never once took what did not belong to him. By 47, Marcus's life had narrowed to 3 things he loved and could not afford to lose. There was his daughter, Nia, 16 years old, sharp as a blade and already talking about becoming a nurse. the first person in the family who might ever wear a white coat instead of scrubbing the floor beneath one. There was his mother, Ruth, now in her 70s, her kidneys failing, tethered 3 days a week to a dialysis machine that cost more per month than Marcus earned. And there was his own stubborn dignity, the one possession no creditor had figured out how to seize. Every night he pushed his cart down the polished hospital corridors, invisible to the doctors and the wealthy patients. And every night he told himself the same thing: broke is not the same as broken. The Ashfords lived in a different America entirely. The fortune had been built by one man, Cornelius Ashford, the grandfather, a hard old titan who had started with a single freight route and turned it into shipping, then real estate, then holdings so tangled that even his accountants needed a map. But Cornelius was not a warm man, but he was a fair one, and in his final years he had grown to distrust almost everyone who shared his last name. He watched his son Gerald spend money faster than the company could make it. He watched his grandnephew Preston treat the family name like a credit card with no limit. And he watched, with the only tenderness he had left, as his granddaughter Vivian grew into the one Ashford who actually cared about the thousands of people the empire employed. Vivian Ashford was not what the tabloids expected an heiress to be. She was 29, restless, and quietly at war with her own family. Where Gerald saw the company as a machine for extracting money, Vivian saw the drivers, the dock workers, the warehouse crews, the families who depended on a paycheck the Ashfords could end with a signature. She had begun pushing for changes: better wages, safer conditions, a foundation in her grandfather's name. And in doing so, she had made herself deeply inconvenient to the relatives who preferred the money flow exactly as it always had. More than one shareholder meeting had ended with Gerald's face red and Vivian's jaw set. She was, by every account, the most alive person in that family, which is what made what happened to her so hard for the people who loved her to accept. Because roughly 3 months before Marcus ever heard her name, Vivian Ashford went into the hospital for what the family described as a minor, routine procedure, and she did not come back out. Something went wrong on the table, they said. She slipped into a coma, they said. The doctors could not explain it, they said. And almost overnight, the woman who had been fighting to change the entire direction of the Ashford empire was silent, still, and unable to object to anything at all. Her Uncle Gerald stepped smoothly into the role of family spokesman. He held Vivian's hand for the photographers. He spoke movingly of hope and prayer. And behind the scenes, with a calm that should have chilled anyone paying attention, he began making arrangements for a future in which his niece never woke up. The problem Gerald faced had a number attached to it, and the number was 30. Old Cornelius, who had died a year earlier, had left behind a will that his lawyers had begged him to simplify and that he had refused to change. In it was a condition that no one had thought much about while Vivian was healthy. The full inheritance, controlling interest in the entire Ashford empire, would pass to Vivian only if she was lawfully married on or before her 30th birthday. If she was not, control would scatter into a trust with rules that would tie Gerald's hands for the rest of his life. Vivian, single and focused on her work, had always laughed off the clause. Now she lay in a coma, her birthday 19 days away, and that forgotten line had become the most valuable sentence in America. So Gerald and his lawyer, a smooth and expensive man named Harlan Voss, built a plan. If Vivian could be married before the deadline, the inheritance would trigger, and as her legal guardian and the husband's true paymaster, Gerald could control it all through her. But the husband could not be anyone real. Not a boyfriend, not an equal, not a man with his own lawyers and his own ambitions. The husband had to be a nobody, someone with nothing to lose and no one to fight for him, someone who would take a check, sign a stack of papers, agree never to speak of it, and then walk out of their lives forever. Gerald turned to Voss and said the words that set everything in motion. Find me someone with nothing. A man with nothing has nothing to fight with. They found Marcus in the hospital's own employment records, night maintenance, sole custody of a minor, a mother on charity dialysis, debts in collection. On paper, he looked perfect, a desperate man who would be grateful for scraps and too frightened to ever cause trouble. Voss slid a folder across Gerald's desk and said, "We found him." What none of them understood because it was the one thing that never showed up on a credit report, was the sentence Ruth Bell had planted in her son 40 years earlier. When Voss approached Marcus in that parking garage and laid out the offer, $500,000 to marry a comatose stranger and disappear, Marcus did the one thing that broke the entire plan before it began. He looked at the money that could save his mother's life, and then he said he would not sign anything until he had met the woman first. Harlan Voss thought the request was almost sweet, the way you might find a child's logic sweet. Meet her? She was in a coma. She would never know. But Marcus was firm in the quiet way that unsettled people who were used to buying their way past resistance, and so, to keep him agreeable, they allowed it. On a gray Tuesday afternoon, a night shift janitor was escorted into the private wing he had only ever cleaned, and for the first time he stood on the other side of the glass, not as the man who emptied the room, but as the man they wanted to marry the woman inside it. He looked at Vivian Ashford for a long time, pale, thin, machines breathing for her, and something in him, some refusal he could not fully name, quietly decided that whatever he did next, he would not treat her like a bank vault with a heartbeat. The wedding, if you can call it that, took place 4 days later in that same room. There were no guests. There was no music, no family, no joy. There was a bought official who asked no hard questions, a pair of witnesses on Voss's payroll, and a stack of documents thicker than a phone book. Marcus wore a rented suit because he did not own one. He stood at the foot of the bed and listened to a man he had met once recite words that were meant to bind his life to a stranger's. When the official asked if he took Vivian to be his wife, the room went silent except for the machines. Marcus looked at the woman who could not answer for herself, and he said, "I do," and he meant it far more seriously than anyone in that room intended him to. Then came the part of the plan that was supposed to be simplest of all. Sign here, and here, and here. Take the first payment. Go home. Do not come back. Do not call. Do not speak to the press, to friends, to anyone. In 90 days, the marriage would have served its purpose. The inheritance would be secured, and the rest of the money would appear in his account so long as he stayed silent and stayed gone. Gerald shook his hand with a politician's smile and considered the matter closed. In his mind, Marcus Bell had already ceased to exist, a tool used and set aside. He returned to the estate that night satisfied that he had solved his problem cheaply, using exactly the kind of man who could be relied upon to know his place and keep it. But Marcus did not stay gone. The trouble was that Marcus still worked in that hospital. Every night his cart rolled down the same corridors, past the same private wing, past the same door behind which lay the woman who was now, on paper and in the eyes of the law, his wife. And Marcus could not do what he had been paid to do, which was to feel nothing. He would pause outside her room. He would look in through the narrow window, and one night, when the wing was empty and the family's paid watchers had gone home, he simply went inside, pulled a chair up beside the bed, and started to talk to her. About his mother, about Nia, about the strange, sad thing that had happened to them both. He did not know if she could hear him. He only knew that no one should be that alone. It became a habit, and then it became the most important part of his day. The nurses on the night shift, most of whom knew Marcus by name because he was the rare person who knew theirs, mentioned that Vivian had loved old soul records, the kind her grandfather used to play. So Marcus brought a small speaker and played them softly in the dark. He read to her from the newspaper. He told her about Nia's grades and Ruth's rough weeks. He treated the silent woman in that bed as though she were still entirely a person, because in his bones he believed she was. What Marcus did not know, what no one had told him, was that a machine at the nurse's station recorded her vital signs around the clock, and that on the nights he sat with her, those numbers quietly began to change. He also did not know that his little nightly visits had been noticed. The Ashfords maintained a private nurse and a security presence far heavier than any comatose patient required, and word traveled quickly up the chain. Gerald received the report with a frown that deepened into something harder. The janitor was still coming. Worse, he was talking to her, touching her hand, playing music, behaving less like a man who had been paid off and more like a husband. He was supposed to sign and vanish, Gerald said to Voss, his voice very quiet. Why is he still here? It was the first crack in a plan that had seemed airtight. And cracks, once they start, have a way of finding the weakest point and running. Then came the night that changed everything. Marcus was mid-sentence, telling Vivian about a foolish argument he'd had with Nia over curfew, his hand resting over hers the way it did now out of pure habit, and he felt it. Her fingers tightened around his, just barely, just for a moment, but unmistakably, deliberately, a human answer to a human touch. Marcus went cold, then hot, then found himself on his feet calling for the nurse. Two of them came. They checked her, murmured to each other, wrote something on the chart, told him it was likely an involuntary reflex, common in these cases, nothing to raise his hopes over. But Marcus had felt it, and he knew the difference between a twitch and a squeeze. What he did not yet understand was why, the very next morning, someone quietly altered the medication order on Vivian Ashford's chart, and why no one on staff would admit to signing it. From that night forward, Marcus stopped being only a visitor and started, without quite deciding to, becoming something like an investigator. He had no training for it. He had no authority, no badge, no right to any of the records he was about to go looking through. What he had instead was proximity, the invisible man's greatest weapon. He was in that building every single night. He knew which nurses were kind and which were bought. He knew which cabinets were locked and which were not, which cameras worked and which had been dead for years and never fixed. And now he had a question he could not put down. If Vivian could squeeze his hand, if some part of her was fighting her way back toward the surface, then why did everyone with money seem so determined to insist she never would? He started with the small things, the details that did not fit. He learned from an old chart left carelessly on a counter that Vivian had been, by every measure, a healthy young woman before the routine procedure that supposedly went wrong. No prior condition, no warning. He learned that her original doctor, a woman she had trusted for years, had been abruptly replaced within a week of the coma by a physician the family brought in privately, a Dr. Lena Cross, who answered, it seemed, only to Gerald. He learned that Vivian's private duty nurse had been swapped out twice, always right after the regular staff noted signs of improvement. Each fact on its own meant nothing. Together they formed a shape Marcus did not want to see, but could no longer unsee. Every time Vivian got better, something happened, and then she got worse again. For a while, his suspicion landed on Dr. Cross. She was cold, evasive, and always seemed to appear at the exact moment Vivian showed any change. But the more Marcus watched, the less it fit. Cross looked less like a mastermind and more like a woman who was afraid, a doctor being made to do something she could not refuse, glancing over her shoulder, flinching whenever Gerald's name came up. So Marcus's suspicion moved to the cousin, Preston, who visited rarely and always left in a hurry, and whose gambling debts, Marcus would later learn, made him desperate for the inheritance to trigger. Preston had motive to spare, but Preston was sloppy and loud, and the thing being done to Vivian was quiet and precise. Marcus kept circling, kept being wrong, and the story kept refusing to give up its true shape. He needed records he could not legally reach, so he called the one person from his old life he still trusted completely. Ray had grown up 2 doors down from Marcus, and now worked in medical records for a hospital network across the state. Marcus did not ask him to break the law. He asked him a careful question. If a patient's medication and lab history looked a certain way, what would it mean? Over several long phone calls in his car in the parking garage, Marcus described what little he had seen, and Ray, growing quieter with each detail, finally said the sentence that made Marcus grip the steering wheel. Man, healthy people don't just stay under like that. Something has to be keeping them there. It was the first time anyone had said out loud what Marcus had been too afraid to think. Now I want to stop here for a moment, because what Marcus was about to find is the turning point of this entire story, and I don't want you to miss it. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. And while you're down there, tell me this. If you were in Marcus's shoes, a poor man with everything to lose and no power at all, would you have kept pulling on the thread? Or would you have taken your check and walked away while you still cool 9OD? Because most people, if they are honest, would have walked. Marcus didn't. And what he uncovered next is the reason this became a story worth telling at all. There was one nurse Marcus trusted above all the others, an older woman named Grace, who had worked that floor for 30 years and had never once been able to look away from something wrong. Marcus went to Grace with everything he had noticed, half expecting her to tell him he was imagining it. Instead, she went very still, and then she told him she had noticed things too. Orders that appeared without a doctor's real signature, a private drug supply she was not allowed to log, a family that watched their comatose relative less like grieving loved ones and more like guards. Together, over several nights, they pieced through what records they could reach, and they found something buried in the legal file that stopped them both cold. The Ashfords had petitioned a court, twice, to have Vivian declared permanently and irreversibly incapacitated, and both petitions were dated before the day she ever fell into the coma. Sit with that, because Marcus and Grace did, in the dim light of an empty break room, hardly breathing. You cannot file paperwork declaring that a healthy woman will never recover from a coma she has not yet suffered. Unless, of course, you already know she is going to suffer it. Unless the coma was never an accident on an operating table at all, but a thing that was done to her and then maintained, deliberately, night after night, by someone adding to her body what should never have been there. The routine procedure that went wrong. The doctor swapped for a frightened one who answered only to the family. The medication orders that changed every time she started to wake. The relatives so strangely certain she never would. It all pointed to one unbearable conclusion, and Marcus finally forced himself to name it. Nobody was waiting for Vivian Ashford to die. Somebody was keeping her from waking up. To be sure, Marcus needed proof he could hold in his hand, not a theory he could be laughed out of. So he did the most dangerous thing he had done yet. Late one night, with Grace keeping watch, he retrieved a copy of Vivian's most recent blood panel from the file Cross kept updating. He could not read most of it, but Ray could. Marcus photographed the pages and sent them, and he sat in his car until nearly dawn waiting for the call. When it came, Ray's voice was low and shaking. There was a compound in Vivian's blood, Ray said, a powerful sedative agent, present at a level no legitimate treatment would ever explain. It was the kind of thing you would give someone to keep them deeply, continuously unconscious. Marcus, Ray said, whoever's doing this, they're not treating her. They're drugging her. And if you found this, you need to be real careful, because they will not let you keep it. Here, then, is the truth that Marcus had uncovered, the truth the entire Ashford family had spent a fortune to bury. Vivian's coma was no accident of the operating table. During that routine procedure, and every day since, she had been given a sedative designed to hold her under, to keep the most inconvenient member of a billion-dollar family silent and still and legally helpless. Gerald had not simply taken advantage of a tragedy, he had manufactured one. The plan was almost elegant in its cruelty. Keep Vivian unconscious, marry her off to a disposable stranger before the birthday deadline so the inheritance would trigger. Control the entire empire through his guardianship of her. And then, once everything was safely in his hands, let nature appear to take its course, quietly withdraw her care, mourn beautifully, and dispose of the paper husband who had already been paid to disappear. The paper husband was meant to be the perfect fallback, too. If anyone ever asked questions, there was Marcus, a poor, desperate man who had married a comatose heiress for $500,000 and then, how convenient, been the last person with her when her condition declined. A janitor with debts and a motive laid out in plain sight. Gerald had not only bought himself a husband for Vivian, he had bought himself a suspect. Every piece of the plan assumed that Marcus was exactly what his bank account said he was, small, frightened, and grateful. Not one of them had planned for the possibility that the man they chose for having nothing to fight with would turn out to be the only person in Vivian's life willing to fight for her at all. And now that man was holding a blood panel that could send them all to prison. But knowing the truth and surviving it are two different things, and Marcus understood he was now the most dangerous loose thread in the whole scheme. His first act was not to run to the police, who might not believe a janitor over an empire's lawyers. His first act was quieter and braver. With Grace's help, he made certain that whatever sedative was reaching Vivian's IV stopped reaching it. And he did it without tipping off the people watching her. Then he simply waited. And he prayed. sitting by her bed through the long nights as her body, freed at last from the thing holding it down, began the slow climb back toward the light. Her color changed, her breathing deepened. The numbers on the monitor, for the first time in 3 months, started to look like the numbers of a person coming home. And here is the part that still moves me. As Vivian rose toward the surface, it became clear that some fragment of her had been aware far longer than anyone believed. In the weeks of Marcus's visits, in the dark, she had been listening, his voice reading the newspaper. The old soul records her grandfather loved, the stories about Nia and Ruth, the warmth of a stranger's hand over hers when no one was paying him to offer it. She could not move, could not speak, could not signal in any way the world would recognize. But she was there, drifting just below the surface, and the one steady thing in that endless dark had been the voice of a man she had never met.
Scared.
I'm here. I'm not going anywhere.
Thank you.
Always.
Gerald, of course, was not a man who lost quietly. When the reports reached him that Vivian's vitals were strengthening, that she was surfacing, that the janitor was somehow at the center of it, he moved fast. He cornered Marcus in a stairwell of that hospital.
It's important.
What is it?
Just take it and go, now.
All right, I'm going.
He offered money, double the original sum, triple, whatever it took for Marcus to walk out of that building. Forget the blood panel, forget Grace, forget Vivian, and let the family handle its own. He spoke to Marcus the way you speak to a machine you are recalibrating, certain that the right number would make the problem go away. And Marcus, a man who at that moment still had $7 to his name 3 months earlier, looked at him and said the words that defined everything he was. You paid for my name on a piece of paper. You could never afford the rest of me. That was the moment Gerald understood he had lost, though he did not yet understand how completely. Because as the sedative cleared and Vivian's mind returned, she did something no one in that family had prepared for. She opened her eyes. Not to the relatives who had gathered for the cameras, not to the doctor who had betrayed her oath. She opened her eyes in the middle of the night, in a quiet room, to the sight of a tired man in a folding chair, who had come back for her every single night when there was no money left in it for him. And her first clear words, cracked and barely a whisper, were not a cry for help and not a demand for a lawyer. She looked at Marcus and she asked him a question that revealed she knew something about her grandfather's will that Gerald, for all his scheming, had never known at all. To understand what Vivian knew, we have to go back 1 year, to the final weeks of old Cornelius Ashford's life, and to a detail that will make you see this entire story differently. Before he died, Cornelius spent his last month not in a private wing surrounded by family, because he had come to trust almost none of them, but in an ordinary room in an ordinary hospital, registered under a plain name so no one would fuss over him. He wanted, at the end, to be treated like a regular man and see how the world treated regular men. And in that month, a maintenance worker on the night shift kept finding an old, dying stranger awake and alone at 3 in the morning, and kept stopping to sit with him, to talk, to listen, to bring him water and a kind word, and, once, an old soul record played low on a small speaker. That worker never learned the old man's real name. That worker was Marcus Bell.
Tonight? A little better, thank you.
I'm here if you need anything.
Than from any blood relative who stood to inherit his fortune, and it changed the way he thought about everything he had built. That is why he refused to let his lawyers simplify his will. That strange marriage clause, the one everyone assumed was just an old man's whim about family and legacy, was something else entirely. Cornelius had come to believe that his fortune had rotted the character of nearly everyone it touched, and he wanted it to pass only to someone whose character could survive it. He built the clause as a test, and he wrote into it, in language his greedy relatives skimmed right past, that the fortune would ultimately be judged not by who Vivian married, but by whether that person proved worthy of standing at her side. Gerald thought he was gaming a loophole. He was walking straight into the trap the old man had laid for exactly his kind. So when Gerald handpicked a poor, disposable janitor to marry his comatose niece, he did not realize he had reached, out of the entire city, for the one man who had already earned old Cornelius Ashford's trust without ever knowing who he was. He had not chosen a nobody. He had chosen the one person the founder of the empire would have chosen himself. And Vivian, drifting in that dark, half hearing the voice beside her, had slowly realized who her strange new husband was. The same gentle presence her grandfather had described to her, with tears in his eyes, in one of their last real conversations. Her first whispered question to Marcus was simply this: "You're the one who sat with him, aren't you? The old man in room 14. And when Marcus, baffled, said that he had, Vivian began weakly to cry, because she finally understood that her grandfather had reached out from beyond the grave to send her the one person who would not sell her. The rest came apart quickly, the way these things do once the truth has a witness who will not be bought. The blood panel, the altered records, the petitions dated before the coma, Grace's testimony, Dr. Cross finally breaking under the weight of what she had been forced to do, and telling investigators everything. It buried Gerald under his own scheme. The marriage that had been arranged as a sham, meant to be dissolved the moment it had served its purpose, now stood as the one true thing in the entire affair, because the man in it had never once treated it as fake. And Marcus, who could have taken the money and vanished at any point along the way, who was offered fortune after fortune to look away, turned out to be the only character in this
How are
billion-dollar
you
story.
feeling?
Better now that you're here.
I'm not going anywhere.
It tells us that wealth does not build character. It reveals it. It tells us that the people we look straight through, the ones with rough hands and empty pockets, and names we never bothered to learn, are sometimes carrying the only thing that can't be bought or repossessed. Gerald had everything money could buy, and none of the thing that mattered. Marcus had nothing money could buy, and all of it. And an old man dying alone in a plain hospital room understood the difference well enough to bet $1 billion empire on it. Now I want to leave these questions with you, because the comments are where this story keeps living. Was Marcus simply lucky, or was he chosen? Would you have kept coming back to that room when no one was watching and no one was paying? And be honest with yourself. Would you have taken the money? Tell me the truth down in the comments, because I read them and I want to know. If a powerful family offered you a fortune to walk away and keep quiet, to take the check and forget what you'd seen, would you have walked? Or would you have done what Marcus did and refused to be bought at any price? There is no wrong answer, only an honest one. And I think what you choose says a lot about who you are. And if this story moved you, stay close, because the next one may hit even harder. The story of a man who was pushed out of the very company he built by his own son, told he was finished, told to be grateful for the pension, and who came back, quietly, and ended up owning the building they threw him out of. Subscribe and stay with me for more true stories where the ones the world counted out get the last word.